started. Got a lot of material to cover today, so would like to try and leave some time for questions at the end if we can. So thanks all for coming to our talk today about recipes. We're also going to focus specifically on some of the exciting ways that they can make it easier to work with dates and times in Drupal. In case anyone doesn't know me, my name is Martin Anderson-Clutz. I'm a Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia. I'm also on the Talking Drupal podcast, and last year I was named the track lead for the events recipe as part of the Starshot initiative, aka Drupal CMS. I also have done a bunch of certifications, including lots of Drupal-y things, some other things like UX, and then if anybody wants to contact me, they can find me on all of the Drupal and social channels as Mandglue. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about why recipes are an important thing for Drupal. We're going to jump right in and see a live demo. We're going to talk about what makes up a recipe, how to apply recipes, some of the things that are being worked on, and then focus specifically on some recipes that are related to events. So first off, why do we need these things called recipes? So for a long time in the Drupal space, we've had these things called distributions and install profiles. Let's have a show of hands who's worked with a distribution or install profile. Now keep your hand up if you've never had a problem using distributions and install profiles. So all the hands went down for anybody who is watching the recording. So definitely have been known to have a variety of problems for both the people maintaining them, because they can be sort of challenging and intricate to maintain over time, the distribution itself. But then the downstream site owners then have some challenges, because if the distribution isn't well maintained, then that can give them problems in terms of things like not being able to apply important security updates. There are also challenges because you have to start with something like a distribution or an install profile. You can't sort of add it to your site later on after you've already started on it. You can't sort of take pieces of it. So you couldn't do something like, say, I want to take some of the commerce functionality that's in something like Commerce Kickstart and then merge it with some pieces of like the Red Hand Razor fundraising distribution. You sort of have to like pick one or the other and stay with that. And then also, they haven't always been super easy to find, particularly for people who are new to Drupal. So, you know, they may start building a site and then 3 months in here, oh, well, if you were building a commerce site, this Commerce Kickstart could have saved you all kinds of time. And it's like, well, that would have been useful to know 3 months ago. So the solution is this thing that we're calling recipes. And really what they're meant to be is kind of a lightweight and composable way to add pre-built functionality into your website. You can think of it as being able to quickly install, in just a few minutes, things that might have taken even an experienced Drupal developer, hours, days, in some cases weeks to set up on your site. And so you can see where that makes a huge difference in terms of new people being able to come to Drupal and, accomplish more sophisticated things. It means that they can follow sort of community-aligned best practices out of the gate, as opposed to sort of having to fumble their way through certain things and then realize that, they took kind of the wrong approach because they just didn't know, and then having to sort of redo a whole bunch of work. But importantly, at least for a lot of the people who work on recipes, they like to say or emphasize that the terminology is that we apply recipes to sites. We don't install them, because they don't actually contain any code of their own. So it's really a set of configuration, and the idea is that when you apply a recipe to your site, the end result should be the same as if an experienced Drupal developer came in and made all of those configuration changes by hand. Recipes are easy to share, and also they don't lock you into a certain approach. So you can apply a recipe and then only keep parts of it. You can do things like just rip it out entirely and install a different one. So it's really meant to be a very flexible way to add different functionality to your site, quickly and easily and in a very flexible way. All that being said, let's jump into a live demo here. So what I have is a fresh install of Drupal CMS. We'll go here to the Create menu and see it's got just sort of the content types and media types that you get out of the box. So really just basic page. And we'll go into the project browser. And what we'll do is apply the events recipe. So go select, install that project. And then it's going to tell us that that succeeded. By the way, while we're waiting, who here has actually played around with Drupal CMS? Awesome. Anybody actually have a Drupal CMS site in production yet? One. Very nice. Okay. All right, so let's refresh the page. And now, what we can see here is that we actually have an event content type, and now we can go in, create our events, and so on. So you have the ability to associate locations, as well as sort of the standard pieces that are common to a lot of the different content types in Drupal CMS. Now, that being said, Drupal CMS isn't the only way you can benefit from recipes in terms of managing dates and times in Drupal. So here I've got sort of a base install of Drupal core. And so again, to validate, we've got just the article and basic page content types that you get out of the box. And now we're going to go ahead and apply some recipes on the command line. So let's go to here, and let's actually stop. Sure, yeah, I can do that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. While that's going to... This part is not exciting because I'm just starting the container, but I will still make it bigger for the sake of the recording. So it's worth pointing out here that what we're going to be doing is applying some recipes that are really available in the contrib ecosystem. So if you have just a fresh site that's based on Drupal 11 core as opposed to Drupal CMS, you can go ahead and use these. And here's what that process looks like. So ddev, drush, recipe, and then you point it to the recipe you want to install. So in Drupal 11, they live outside of the doc root, and then we'll go ahead and say the events recipe. So you can see it installed a few modules, applied some configuration changes, and now if we go back and reload our site, again, we've got our event content type. You'll notice that there's some differences. Obviously, Drupal CMS is opinionated by design, and so the recipe is opinionated in its own way too. So there are some differences in terms of the ordering of fields and so on, but you have sort of the same functionality. But let's go ahead. Maybe we'll say, let's make this 2 p.m. We can make that 90 minutes. Go ahead and save that. And we've got our sort of, deduplicated date display. We've got add to calendar fields that are using SVGs. So there are some nice things you get out of the box, really just with that base events recipe. But we can go back here and we can add to that. So maybe we want to add a calendar. So we can say, let's go ahead and apply the events calendar. Maybe we want to do recurring events. Maybe we want to have registration. And of course, the excitement of a live demo is that very often something will go unexpectedly awry. So I have a colleague who likes to say, if it's a live demo and something doesn't go wrong, you should be suspicious that it's not actually live. So there you go, proof positive. But I think for today, that's probably enough to get us a demonstration of the extra capabilities. There we go. I do find that when applying recipes on the command line, it's often a good idea to clear the cache afterwards. Now, if we go back in and edit our event, we should see some extra abilities, like the ability to have recurring events. So we could say, let's repeat this weekly and end after 10 times and save that. Notice that the display now has been updated. It's using a formatter that's specifically optimized for recurring events. We do also have a view for displaying our events, and then we also have this now interactive calendar view that includes our recurring event instances, and we can drag and drop to reschedule a specific date. We can go in, drag and drop to reschedule within the day. We can do things like drag and drop, drag to change the duration, or even do things like, let's go a little further up. We can drag and drop to make it all day as well. And now if we go back to our calendar, we can see that that's in as an all-day event, And if we go back to the event, we can see that it saved those changes to the database as well. So makes it very intuitive, lots of flexibility. There are also recipes for registration, for adding references to locations and so on. So lots that you can sort of, again, quickly build out of the box.
Is there a way to export that, say, just shove it into Google Calendar?
To have, well, okay, so the question was, is there a way to export that out to a Google Calendar? You can definitely use add to calendar links to sort of individually do those, or with recurring events, the add to calendar will actually add the recurring event to your Google Calendar. So yes, there are ways, other things in discussion, but happy to talk about that maybe at the end or offline. So let's jump back into our slideshow. And also point out there is this wiki page on Drupal.org, the recipes cookbook. It has a variety of different recipes that you can try out. So again, organizations like Canopy have their own sort of site starter recipes. You can try those out. There are ones that add separate specific kinds of functionality. So the events ones are on there. There's the ones for site alerts, a variety of things. But by all means, check that out. There is a QR code here. You can check that out. I'm going to make the slides available at the end, so that's also linked to the page as well. So just be aware of all of that. So what goes into a recipe? Really, the basic structure in some ways can be similar to other kinds of projects like modules or themes. So probably one of the most important files is the composer.json, because that's where you're going to declare all of your dependencies. And then the recipe.yaml is really sort of the heart of the recipe in terms of really telling Drupal about what are all of the pieces that need to be included within your recipe. So you can specify other recipes that should be applied as part or sort of before your recipe gets applied. You can specify if there are modules or themes that should be installed as part of your recipe. You can, and I guess the key thing there is when it installs those as part of a recipe, it's going to import any basic configurations. So think of like the kinds of things that would be on like a settings page for a module. But it's not going to automatically import any configuration entities that are provided by that module. So you think about views and all of the default ones that you get. If you were to install that as part of a recipe, it wouldn't bring those in by default. And so config import is where you can specify either for a particular project, pull in all of those configuration entities, or you can specify particular ones. And then there's this new thing called config actions, which is a really flexible way to sort of alter or add to your site's configuration, and we'll talk about that more in depth. Optionally, you can also have a folder of sort of static configuration files, so that's similar to the kinds of configuration that a module or theme can include today. And then you can also optionally include a content folder to have content automatically created as your recipe is applied. So here's an example. This is actually, again, a contrib recipe, so you could pull this down from Drupal.org and play around with it if you wanted to. But you can see it has the structure that we've talked about. So we've got our composer.json. We've got a variety of static config files. We've got 3 taxonomy terms that are going to be created. And notice that it puts those in nested in a subdirectory that's keyed by the actual entity type. And then our recipe.yaml file. In this case, we've also got a README file. So the composer.json file is going to be pretty similar to what you're used to in other kinds of projects. Obviously, the key difference here is having a type of Drupal recipe. That's how Composer is going to know where to put this and how to handle it. But then in the same way you would with other kinds of projects, you define all of your requirements, and Composer will manage all of those. And you can also provide a suggest key. That'll basically, on the command line, output a suggestion for the site builder to potentially add those other projects. There's discussion that maybe one day those suggestions will actually go into Project Browser, but that's for something down the road. The recipe.yaml file is, I would say, in some ways very similar to like the info.yaml you would have in a module or theme. So you've got your name, description, and type. But now we have this ability to specify other recipes. So if you want your recipe to build on other recipes, you can have this one apply. You can also specify modules or themes that you want your recipe to install. So in this case, we've got a couple related to paragraphs. And then here's where you can say there are specific entities that we want to make sure, configuration entities that get imported. So in this case, we're using a wildcard to say everything that's provided within paragraphs EE, get those all imported, or for paragraphs features, we've got a specific one that we say just pull in that individual one. That's the only one that we depend on for our recipe. The next part is really the config actions. So config action really has these three parts. So the actual ID of the configuration that you want to manipulate, so either to create from scratch or to update in this case. The actual action that you want to take, so in this case we're using simple config update. And then the actual arguments, so sort of, the key and the value. How many you need and which ones you can use will vary based on the actual action that you're using. And it's worth pointing out that some of the actions have both plural and singular forms depending on how you want to apply them.
You have to understand all the syntax for each of these, or is there a way to export to it, or?
So the question was if you have to understand the syntax of the config actions or if there's a way to export. So there currently is no sort of automated way to export them. There is a VS Code extension that you can use that can help to sort of help you understand what certain ones, which ones are available and how they work. But there is also quite good documentation. So as an example, here's another QR code that leads to the config actions page, in this case specifically for the first category that I'm going to talk about, the global entity actions. So these are config actions that you can apply to really any kind of configuration. So simple config updates, we'll just go in and update a particular piece of configuration. Create if not exists basically says if the site configuration doesn't have this already, go ahead and create it, but if there is something by this key, then just do nothing. And I think you'll find as we go through that a lot of them are by design, tried to follow a naming convention that makes them pretty obvious what they do. But understand, as I say, that we have some config actions that you can apply anywhere, but other ones that are specific to certain kinds of configurations. So as an example, if you're working on updating some roles, you've got a config action called grant permissions that can add permissions to one or more roles. In the same way, you have ones that for workflows can add specific node types or taxonomy vocabularies to your workflows and so on. To make them more flexible, you can also use wildcards. So in this case, you can see we're saying let's grant this access content permission to all of the roles that are available within the site. In the same way, you can set a component on, every view of every content type. So using two wildcards in this case. So you can see the design here is to try and make them so that they can be flexible enough to allow you to do some very powerful things without having to write a lot of code. I think the actions that are available for placing blocks are really good demonstration of the flexibility of config actions. So within something like a custom module, you could place a block, but you would have to explicitly provide the specific theme name, the specific region, and the weight, the numerical weight of that block. And so if it was for a site that you manage, you might know all of those things and be able to provide that, but it becomes really tricky in sort of a contrib space to have something that's going to be flexible enough to work on any site. And that's why it's really awesome that we have these two config actions, place block in default theme or place block in admin theme, so you don't need to know any of those things. You can say, let's place a block in the default theme, so the front end of the site. We can give it an array of regions. So, if it's the Bootstrap theme, use the footer region. If it's the Gesso theme, use the page bottom, and so on. And you can also have a fallback. So say, if none of the others are above, or so the theme isn't in that array, just use the content region. And then you can, for a position, say first or last. And the actual config action will do the work of calculating the numerical value so that the block will appear, top or bottom, depending on what you've specified. So it's a lot more flexible in terms of being able to work across a lot more use cases for being able to do things like place blocks. One of the other things that's new in Drupal 11 is you have the ability in your recipe to opt out of strict config comparison. So it effectively treats each of even the static files that you provide as being sort of like create if not exist. So if it sees that it's there, it's going to say that's fine, and I'm not going to worry about any differences. So it definitely makes it easier to create recipes, and it's also going to make it to sort of mix and match recipes as well. Also worth pointing out that the config actions are actually an API. So if you have things that you want to be able to do with config actions and you can't find a config action that does that already, you can provide a class like what we see here. So obviously you need to provide an ID. You can optionally provide a set of entity types. So if you wanted to only work on certain entity types, you can specify that. You can assign a deriver, and then obviously you need to put in the code. But it's pretty powerful that, this is a system that you can also extend to meet your own very specific needs as well. I know that Search API has already implemented its own config actions, so it's great to see that like the contrib space is already starting to adopt this and extend it as well, and hopefully that's something we'll see more of in the future. There are some best practices around creating recipes. So one of them is called item potency, which a year ago was a word I had literally never heard. Item potency is the idea that you can apply a recipe to your site again and again, and you shouldn't have errors. So to be able to implement that, a lot of times you need to be sort of mindful of how you construct the recipe. So, using config actions like create if not exists, or turning off your strict comparison checking, maybe being selective of where you do that. So if you look at Drupal CMS, it typically will do that for things like field storage only as the places where it really wants to make sure that that there is that alignment of what's expected versus what's in the site. Typically, it's a best practice to try and keep your recipes fairly granular. You want to have these, again, sort of composable in how they can be reused. And also go ahead and publish these. I mean, you can publish them directly to Packagist. If you go back to that recipes cookbook that we talked about earlier, you'll see that there's a bunch of those that aren't in Drupal.org, but there are some that are published as general projects as well. And if you are looking to publish your recipe as a project on Drupal.org, it definitely does need to be a general project when you create it as well.
Can you have recipes of recipes?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, in some ways, that's exactly what Drupal CMS is a recipe of recipes. But the site starter recipes that you'll see on that cookbook are effectively that. They just bring in a set of other recipes, and that's exactly employing that design methodology of making them very sort of granular and composable. We did mention already that recipes can contain content. It effectively took the functionality for that out of the default content module that's been in the contrib space for some time. So the actual import of default content is now in core. If you want to export content, you could theoretically handcraft that, but probably most of us would rather install the default content module and use it. Provides like drush commands and different things to actually generate that. And then you can sort of take the folders that it generates, the sort of directories, again, sort of organized and keyed by the entity types, and just bring all of that into the content directory within your recipe. And now when anyone applies that recipe, that content will automatically be created for them. So here's an example. Again, this is from a contrib recipe. So the locations recipe is on Drupal.org. And you can see it will install a variety of modules, both core and contrib, specify some different config entities that should be imported as part of installing those, and then it uses config actions to sort of have that item potency so that you can reapply that locations recipe again and again to your website. So in terms of the actual act of applying recipes, we saw earlier that you can, with Drupal CMS, apply recipes through the project browser, which is within that sort of extend section of your Drupal website. Within the installer, you do also have this ability to sort of just click on which recipes you want to include. So that becomes a super intuitive and easy way as part of installing Drupal CMS to include recipes. It's also worth pointing out, though, that the recipes that you can use both in the project browser and in the installer for Drupal CMS are a hard-coded list. So you don't have sort of the ability to, at least through that method, pull in sort of the wider set of recipes that are available as part of the Drupal community. On the command line, we saw using the drush ability to install recipes, or apply recipes, thank you. But there are also sort of, more bare scripts. Really, the drush recipe command is a wrapper for that script call. It's also useful to understand the order in which the recipe runner actually goes through adding these different elements. So the first thing it's going to do is to apply any other recipes that are specified. From there, it's going to install modules and themes, including the basic configuration. Then it's going to import the specified configuration entities. From there, it's going to import any configuration that you have provided as sort of those static files. Then it will apply the configuration actions in your recipe.yaml, and finally it will import any content in your content folder.
I assume there can be collisions and the later things win?
So the question was, if there are collisions, do the later things win? So if there are collisions and it's in strict mode and there isn't a match, then it will actually error out and nothing will change on your website. But if you have the strict checking off, or if you're using like a create if not exists, then that's where a collision won't matter, because it'll actually ignore the later. So in that case, actually the first one wins. So it's, to some degree, the answer depends on how the recipe is built. There was a significant amount of work done to actually start moving some of the core install profiles into sets of recipes. So today the standard profile is actually a set of recipes, includes some more granular recipes like you see here. And so typically what we would say is, if you want to create your own site starter recipe, it's better to, as much as possible, use any of the core ones that's kind of aligned to how you want to create things anyway, because certainly from kind of a overall long-term total cost of ownership, it's going to be easier if there are parts of it that you don't have to maintain entirely by yourself. So some of the things that are being worked on in the recipe community, a big one is called unpacking recipes. So the thing about recipes is that they can pull in potentially a large set of different dependencies, and then add to your site configuration that depends on those. If you were to then say, compose or remove that recipe, then you would still have the configuration in your website, but no longer have the dependencies, which would leave your site in kind of a broken state. So the idea of unpacking is that you'll have a command that you can run that basically will look through all of the dependencies, both in those recipes, in your recipe, as well as the sort of dependent dependencies, if that makes sense, and add all of those to your site's composer.json. So now you can sort of compose or remove that, and then you'll have both the dependencies as well as the configuration, and you can move on from there. So there's already been some work. The last time I checked, there was sort of a needs review patch. So hopefully that's something we'll see in core soon. We already talked about the ability to use wildcards to make your config actions apply more broadly, but there is also this idea now of being able to have sort of like placeholders, because some of things like configuration that you might want to provide depend on having actually machine names in there, and so being able to have kind of like placeholders in there, again, will make them much more flexible in terms of how they can be used. And there's a whole published roadmap for phase 2 of the recipes initiative. We've already talked about some of these in terms of specifically things like unpacking. There is also already implemented the ability to prompt for input. So if your recipe depends on, let's say, like an API key, something like that, then you can prompt the user. And then the benefit there is that once the recipe is applied, the user doesn't need to know to go to a specific place and add that in before they can actually start using it. It should sort of work out of the box from that point forward. So if you're interested in learning more about some of the things that the community is working on, that's a good resource. There is also quite a bit of documentation. So we've already talked about or shown links to some of those, but the downside is a lot of that documentation today lives as part of the GitLab repo, which is for end users or people just getting started with Drupal, really not the ideal place to discover that. So there is some work needed to sort of bring that into the more standard Drupal documentation system. And that would be a great way to contribute if that's something you'd be interested in. So more generally, if you want to help out with recipes, we talked about documentation. Obviously, if you want to jump in as a developer or even somebody who wants to do testing or help to write tests, then those would be amazing. Certainly, creating your own recipes as sort of ways to demonstrate the power of how they can be used would be great as well. There is a recipes channel in Drupal Slack, and within there we have asynchronous meetings every other Tuesday. And I'm sure there will be lots of sprinting done about recipes at DrupalCon next month as well. So for the remaining time, I'd like to focus a little bit more, bring it back around to events and some of the things that you can do. So we saw the events recipe. It creates an event content type using a smart date field, created those add to calendar links. It does create the view for upcoming and past events. And some of the ongoing improvements that are being worked on there are around improving the user experience and also accessibility. There are sort of locations and events locations recipes. So it's going to set up a content type that has address and geo fields. It's going to use Nominatum, which is provided by OpenStreetMaps, as a free geocoding service, as well as leaflets. So you have sort of sophisticated geocoding and mapping services that don't require any kind of like a paid Google Maps account out of the box. And if you apply this events locations recipe, then your events have sort of a autocomplete that they can use to reference a location, and all of that will work again out of the box. There is the events calendar, which provides the calendar view that we saw earlier in our demo. It's actually based on a refreshed version of the full calendar module, so very popular in like Drupal 7. And then there was some early work done in Drupal 8 days, but full calendar view sort of took over. There's some politics there that I won't get into at the moment, but it provides sort of the drag and drop to edit, double click to add events. Had sort of the toast style notifications, if you notice that. There are some ongoing performance improvements that are being worked on, as well as the ability to show like event information and tooltips and other things like that. There is an events registration system. So it's based on the entity registration module. So instead of sort of like forcing people out to like a meetup or Eventbrite, you can actually have people register directly within Drupal. It uses sort of entity types that are fieldable. So you could say, maybe I have some events where when people register, I want to collect like t-shirt sizes, but other events where when people register, I want to collect food allergies, or maybe I have some events where I want both. And those are all things that are super easy to set up and do directly within Drupal now. There are probably going to be some ongoing work around making the out-of-the-box sort of registration flow as intuitive as possible, but again, if you want to try this out and you have some thoughts on how that could be better, would love some community feedback. We did also see the events recurring recipe. It's actually, if you look at it, a very small recipe. It really only does these 4 things. So it installs a smart date recur submodule. It makes a change in the configuration for the when field on the event content type. It changes the formatter to that recurring one that we saw, and it adds a permission to the editor role. So if you knew how to do those things, it would only take you a couple minutes. So it's not in that sense like a huge time saver, but that's if you knew how to do all of those things and the right sequence and all of those things. So again, in the spirit of making events easy to set up and use in a sophisticated way, even for people new to Drupal, then I thought this would be a valuable thing. Older versions had an issue where they would actually break the item potency of the events recipe, but the newer versions have that solved. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is something called the event platform, which is really a replacement for the older Camp Organizers distribution, or COD as people call it within the community, really bringing that same capabilities into sort of modern Drupal. So it gives you an easy way to spin up a new sort of Drupal Camp website. It's going to create content types for things like sessions, featured speakers, sponsors, and so on. It's going to automatically send notifications when a session is like submitted, accepted, or rejected, those kinds of things. It can also has sort of interactive features for doing things like bulk generating your time slots. It has a drag and drop scheduling feature. There's a submodule that you can use. It'll create a system basically to allow users on the site to sort of like different sessions and then be able to sort of view a personalized schedule of like, these are all of the sessions that I liked, as a way so they're not having to sort of like drag up and down the entire schedule every time. So here's an example. Oh, it's not actually showing there. Let me see if bring it back in. New England Drupal Camp was one of the early adopters. I think a couple of the Drupal dev days have used it as well. There's actually an issue on the event platform project where you can see a list of the camps that have used it, but I thought New England Drupal Camp in particular did a nice job of sort of, theming it and sort of giving it a very visual, distinct style. It's actually a fork of the Florida Drupal Camp website from a couple of years ago. There's talk about maybe unforking them, but maybe that's something we could sprint on tomorrow. So, bringing it back to the topic of our talk, hopefully you can see how recipes and other things like the event platform that are destined to become recipes can really make life easier for you regardless of how you want to manage dates and times in Drupal. So we've got Drupal CMS that has the events recipe, the events recipe ecosystem in Contrib, and the event platform. So lots of different ways that that might meet one of your use cases. If it doesn't meet your specific needs, then some of the approaches in there could be guidance in terms of the best way to meet your needs. But there is also a date time channel in Drupal Slack. And if you have specific questions on managing dates and times, then that's a good place to ask as well. So related to recipes, and images are not doing well in this slideshow today, there are a couple of other talks today related to recipes. So there's one about the new Drupal analytics recipe at 1 p.m. in room 178, and another one about Drupal recipes for themers at 3 p.m. in room 159. So that being said, we have a few minutes for questions, and I see we have one over here.
For the recipes that create content types and fields for content types, is there a way to tweak the way that the content type is created? And, like, for example, if you want the fields to all have a specific prefix that signifies the content type, is there a way to tweak that now or coming?
So the question was, within your recipe, is there the ability to sort of tweak things like the prefix that will be used for the fields that are created? I'm going to have to answer your question with a question and make sure I understand the question. Within the recipe, you can do things like give it whatever prefix you want, but that's up to the recipe creator. There isn't currently really a way that, like, as the person applying the recipe, that you could sort of, choose one path or the other. It's sort of things like, particularly field machine names, would be kind of hard-coded into the recipe, but as the recipe creator, you have the flexibility to follow whatever convention you want.
Right, that hard coding would it be ability to say, I want to add a prefix to the way that you'd have to hard code that in.
Right, so the recipe would include whatever convention that you want, but as for the recipe creator, you can build that however you like. Yeah. Any other questions, Alex?
This is the first, I've heard about recipes for so long, but this is the first comprehensive overview I've seen. It's incredibly exciting, so first congratulations to the whole team behind it, and thank you for sharing with us. As I was listening to a few of the points you made, especially the part about idempotency, about unpacking, about default content, I started thinking about migrations. So the workflow is incredibly similar broadly compared to other aspects of Drupal. Was that a deliberate sort of consideration when they were creating this? And are there any sort of parallels that are being considered, or maybe unification of some parts?
So I'm going to try and repeat the question, and please correct me if I don't accurately capture it. The question was related to the flexibility of recipes and their similarity to migrations, and if there's some intention to maybe have those dovetail or sort of unify, I guess, to some degree further on. I would say because there were lots of core maintainers deeply involved in the process of creating recipes, I'm sure it's no coincidence that there's some similarities between recipes and other parts of the Drupal ecosystem. I know Alex Bott deserves a lot of credit for being sort of in many ways the architect of the system that we have, but there's certainly been lots of other folks, I would say particularly in the last 6 months to a year, who have jumped in and helped in lots of very significant ways. I haven't heard too much about integrating recipes with migrations per se. I could definitely see there potentially being like recipes on how to set up a site to migrate into from like, you know, D7 distributions or something like that. So it's sort of like pre-set up if you have sort of a predictable starting point of where you're migrating from, to be able to set up a site that now you could migrate into with sort of almost like a pre-baked migration script. I think that could be really interesting, but I haven't heard about anything specifically that, you know, really speaks to that per se. Any other questions? We got hands here. Let's go here in the front.
Yeah, is there any tooling for creating recipes currently, like config split to, like, you know, help move the config files in the right spot? That kind of stuff.
So the question was, is there any tooling currently for creating recipes? And I would say the answer to that is really no. I did mention earlier there's a VS Code extension to help sort of like manually write them in a less painful way. There's been, Kevin Quillen, who many people might know from his work on like the OpenAI module and a few others. He wrote like a command line tool for generating recipes, but it really just sort of collects the configuration, so nothing around like config actions or any of that stuff. There has been an issue open on the features module, because if you've used the modern version of the features module, what it really does nicely is it collects together a bunch of configurations. So you tell it what things you want to export, and then it figures out the tree of dependencies for that configuration and then collects that all together for you. And really that's a lot of what you need to do to create a recipe. So there is an idea that some future version of recipe or of the features module could be useful for actually creating recipes, because it's probably got a lot of the guts that you would need, just output it in a slightly different structure. But that's really the extent of the tooling today. I think it's by design meant to be more manual, so that, you know, there's some craftsmanship that goes into them. Also, I think there's still some things that we're working at in terms of like, you know, governance and findability. So if all of a sudden we went from 20 recipes to 20,000, finding good recipes would be a real challenge. So, you know, that's the state of things today, but I'm sure we'll see a lot of progress in the next, you know, 6 months to a year. Yes?
For recipe default content, can I import a recipe without default content, or conversely, just import the recipe content if I've deleted it in the past, for example?
So the question was, with recipes default content, can you apply the recipe without importing the content, or conversely, after you've applied the recipe, go in, and import the content again, for example, if you had deleted it? So I don't believe there's a way that you can apply the recipe without the default content. I mean, you could obviously, you know, move the directory out of the recipe after you've composer required it, and then apply the recipe that way, which is sort of a kludgy way to do it, and certainly would not be recommended. As far as applying them after the fact, because it's based on default content, you could, if that was something that you needed to do on a regular basis, just have default content available within your site, and then you could use that as the way to import the content after the fact, or to sort of like resync the content in some way. But you know, as part of the recipe system, there isn't really anything today that's really designed for those kinds of use cases, I would say. Yes?
Is there any history that you can see if somebody else had ran like 6, 7 recipes? Like, would you be able to figure out like what that person had done? Or
so the question is there sort of a history that's kept as part of applying a recipe? So I would say the answer is that today, by design, there's no history that's kept of what recipes have been applied. Notionally, Project Browser is meant to keep its own history of recipes that have been applied, specifically so that within the interface it can sort of show you which ones have been applied and which haven't. But the actual sort of underlying infrastructure doesn't today have anything designed to sort of keep that history, or give you that sort of like backwards view of what recipes led to the current state. There is something as part of the recipe system that sort of takes a config snapshot before it applies a recipe. And so there's notionally some way that that snapshot system might be able to provide a history or even a rollback state for recipes, but today that only exists in sort of the short term as a way to sort of like, as we saw in my demo, when a recipe fails to apply, that it can roll back to a clean state and it doesn't leave your site broken. So those are probably things that we'll see in the future, I would say, but today don't exist. I think there was another question at the back.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I've managed several websites and built some sites for like yearly alumni events where there might be 100 or 200 sessions across a few days. I know for all of those, we've always needed to add an extra field for a rich text version of the title that can support bold and italic display in the front of the website as opposed to just plain text. And I was just thinking about how if you do use a recipe to build the event system, and you know you need to add that field, would you be better off adding that field to the content type that the recipe creates, or maybe forking the recipe and keeping your own version of it that installs that as part of the installation?
Yeah, so the question was, if you had a recipe that did things like set up sites that accept sessions, and you know that your version needs to have an extra field for things like maybe rich text input where the default is plain text, would it be better to fork the recipe, or maybe have some kind of another approach? Is that a good summation? So I would say in that instance, probably the best thing to do would be sort of to create an add-on recipe that just adds that extra field and depends on let's say it's a contrib module like the event platform, that it basically applies the event platform and then makes the change that you need to add the extra field in that case. Certainly as part of, the way Drupal works, if you feel strongly that it just would make more sense for the recipe to adopt the change that you need anyway, then I feel like that would be a good conversation to have, particularly for something like the event platform. I see I'm actually over time. I know we've got a little bit of extra time before the next session, so if people want to wander out and get snacks, by all means feel free, but if folks want to stay and talk a little bit more, then happy to do that. I will say there's a good chance I'll do a lightning talk about event platform later today, and hoping to sprint on that tomorrow afternoon if any folks are interested and want to get involved in that as well. So, as I say, happy to take more questions, but by all means don't want to stand between you and your refreshments.